Okay, dokes. Good afternoon, everybody. It is really good to be with you all this afternoon. I just want to let you know tomorrow is Friday. So thanks for giving us some of your time on this Thursday afternoon. And I hope in saying that tomorrow is Friday, that there is a little bit of a yay going on in the background, but it's really lovely to just spend some time with you this afternoon. On that note, I think just before we get started, I would like for us to just chat through one or two, yeah, I suppose we can call it house rules. So the first one being we will have a short Q&A session or section in our session after we've spoken to all of our team members on the call this afternoon. However, please do not feel like that is keeping you from posting your insights or your questions in our chat. We do have some of our team members keeping an eye on the chat as we go, so please feel free to make use of that function. And then, of course, our tech isn't always our friend, right? I'm pretty sure all of us have had some experiences that we might not want to mention with online sessions like these. So let's try and just keep ourselves muted for the duration of the session unless we do ask you to do otherwise. And then last but not least, as I said, use our chat function. But if you go throughout the session and something really stands out for you, or our team can perhaps even be of assistance to you, then please feel free to reach out to us afterwards. We will make sure that you have some contact details in the chat, but don't feel like you are left in the dark or unsupported. So if you were on board a FlySAF Air flight, this is where they will turn off the cabin lights, and say that thank you for choosing FlySAF Air, and we hope that you enjoy your flight with us. But I don't think my tone of voice fits that of an air hostess, but nevertheless, I'm going to kick us off and I'm going to welcome some of our team members on the call with us today. First up is Colleen Leclerc. She is the founder and managing director of Connect EQ, and she really brings a bank of knowledge and experience. How do we work with people? How do we help people show up as their best selves, really focusing on well-being and specifically also passionate about this topic. So very excited. Thank you, Colleen, for joining us. I also have Sarah Smale on our call today. She is actually one of our consultants. She's an industrial psychologist. She's really passionate about coaching and workplace counseling. And both her and Colleen actually have done some research. I'm saying some, but some is a lot on this specific topic. So we are really excited to hear from the both of you. Welcome, Sarah. And then last but not least, Nadeem Mohammed. He is joining us from one of South Africa's largest law firms, Cliff Decker Hofmeyer. It's really lovely to have you on the call, Nadeem. He is the director at CDH and is located in the employment law and knowledge management departments. And we're really excited to just give or get some of your insights on this topic as well. So very, very big welcome to the three of you. Shall we kick us off then? Is that it?
Thank you.
Awesome. So as we hop into it, I actually wanted to share a quick quote with you from St. Ambrose, and I shared it with everyone as we were preparing for today's session. But the quote says that no one heals himself by wounding another. And I think that is so fitting with what we are talking about today. Bullying wounds. It doesn't heal. And yeah, I think on that note, I would love to ask Colleen, maybe I'm going to throw the first one to you. Help us understand what is bullying really? So help us understand, is it bullying or am I being too sensitive? Or, how does it differ from just dealing with someone who's difficult at work?
So thanks, Tanae. Thank you for having me. And it's lovely to see so many people on this call. It's clearly quite a topic of interest. From the research, there's no one definition, and there are some key elements that we would need to look into to understand, what is it exactly? So a number of negative acts you'd have to understand based on the intensity, how to add up the negative acts that are occurring to somebody in the workplace. So some 4 key elements: intensity, so estimating bullying by counting these negative acts. Some examples would be isolation, humiliation, intimidation, among others. Repetition is a key definition point, because once-off events don't tend to be seen as bullying. You'd need to have a repetitive, at least 2 negative acts, and also over time. So what is the duration? Research is saying 6 months, but I would say if there are a number of negative acts happening and it's for 3 months, or you're noticing that, then you could technically define it as bullying. And then power imbalance is something that's very important. And in terms of power imbalance, it's about whether the target feels like they can prevent bullying or stop bullying. It can be perceived power imbalance. Different personalities clash, and you might think that someone who's got a stronger personality has got more power, or it can be actual power imbalance where hierarchies play a role. Sometimes you'll have a supervisor or superior who inflicts bullying onto people lower in the organization, or you can have reverse bullying as well, where someone who is at a lower level in the organization hierarchically might be inflicting bullying and negative acts on superiors. So I hope that gives some insights into what bullying is, although there's no one definition, unfortunately, globally, that we can all say that's what it is. These are just some indicators, and I hope these 4 help.
For sure. And maybe talk to us a little bit about the data. What are we seeing in South Africa? What are we seeing globally? What does that look like?
So a lot of the research is coming out of the Scandinavian countries, although some there is research in the UK and in Europe. And the prevalence is in line with what I'm seeing in my study. It's between 3% and 7% prevalence, which seems low. And that's interesting enough, because I'd want to understand, why is it so low? And is there more education required around exactly what bullying is? When I sent my survey out to people, and some people said, I completed your survey, I didn't know that some of the negative acts were considered bullying. So I think there needs to be more of a global standard and some awareness and education around this. So although my study is in line with the 3 to 7% of people experiencing some form of negative act on a daily, weekly, or monthly basis, the percentage goes up when it comes to sometimes. That goes up to about 33% of at least 2 negative acts occurring in the South African sample that I've got in my study.
Interesting. When I was looking at the data as well, and just seeing what the numbers tell us, it said that 45% of bullied employees suffer from stress-related health problems. And so my next question to you would then be, unpack a little bit for us the relationship between the bullying and the psychological well-being. What does that relationship look like?
So in line with what people would hope, and I kind of let out a sigh of relief when I saw it. It sounds ironic. Bullying does have a very strong negative correlation on psychological well-being. you would expect that. I don't think there would be a study in the world that shows otherwise. And so the significant correlation, a negative correlation, it also shows that there's a 12% variance in psychological well-being that is explained by bullying. The interesting thing is with my study, I was looking at coping styles. So 4 coping styles of avoidance, assertiveness, doing nothing, and seeking help. When doing nothing was added to bullying, it worsened the relationship. It actually brought out a lower level of psychological well-being. So whether you need the data or not to help you confirm that doing nothing isn't probably the best option when it comes to bullying, that something needs to be done, the numbers are starting to show that.
Yeah, and I think, like you said, most people, or people sometimes don't do anything. They don't speak up, they don't seek help. So maybe, also considering what are some of the signs that we might see that bullying then is actually taking place, and how can people really equip themselves then in the correct manner.
So looking at the different types of bullying, it was quite interesting to some people who happened to get in touch with me after completing the survey. I used the Negative Acts questionnaire by Anderson, and 3 types of workplace bullying is described in that scale. So work-related, some examples are having information withheld that affects your performance, unreasonable deadlines, excessive monitoring of your work or micromanagement. In line with that, there's an interesting book by Jeffrey Pfeffer called Dying for a Paycheck, and he talks to back-to-back meetings as a sign of toxicity in the workplace. And you can imagine if you've just in back-to-back meetings, triple booked or quadruple booked, when do you actually get time to do your work? And then you've got deadlines to achieve. So work-related bullying is probably the least understood type of bullying, certainly in the South African population. And so we'd have to look at how do we educate people on what work-related bullying means, and what does this do for organizations who are needing people to get the work done? So it's really interesting to how do you strike the balance? And then person-related bullying is your typical being humiliated, key areas of responsibility are removed or replaced with more trivial or unpleasant tasks is interestingly under person-related bullying. And then spreading of gossip and rumors is probably also not really something that people are aware of, that how having conversations with people other than the people you should be having the conversations with can equate to toxicity and therefore turn into person-related bullying. And then physical intimidation, fortunately, my data is showing that this is more of a minimal amount of people experiencing this. This might be due to the fact that not many people are going into the office, so they can't really be physically abused, but that doesn't mean to say that they can't be shouted at or have rude remarks or threats of violence displayed via technology. So those are just some of the common forms and some of the examples of behavior that could be experienced by people.
And it's so funny that you mentioned the not going into the office, and that maybe being the reason that we don't see the larger numbers under the physical threat. But once again, when I looked at the data, 43% of the bully rates for remote workers, with most virtual bullying occurring during online meetings. And I just thought about how we can easily make jokes in virtual meetings, and we see it as that. And I think that's why these types of conversations are important, right? Is to know when those jokes are not only jokes, but they are borderline bullying. They are bullying. They're turning into a case of bullying. And so maybe going back to that point again of people not doing anything about it, what do you think are some of the barriers for people to actually speak up about bullying?
Well, I think it's really about a lack of awareness about what it is. So, like you say, people teasing on meetings, teasing about work. If that kind of behavior is perpetuated, it's tolerated and it becomes normal. So people won't tend to want to speak up. If leadership or culture tolerates bullying, it'll be part of how we do things around here. So it becomes part of that culture. Fear of nothing being done. So if you worried that you're going to report this to someone and then nothing's going to be done, you're exposing yourself in essence. And you might run the risk of having the situation worsen through further victimization. There's also a fear of career impact. And if a person feels like there's no safe space or any trustworthy people to turn to, it can further isolate them and exacerbate any of their mental, emotional, physical issues that they might be facing.
Sarah, I'm super keen to just hear if you have any insights on this as well.
Yeah, thanks. I think it is really difficult to kind of pinpoint workplace bullying. Like Colleen said, some things can just be what we do around here. It is what it is kind of mentality. I think, yeah, also just the definition, not really having set criteria. I know when I did my research, intent was something that popped up. So there needs to be intent to harm. And then something like a joke, was the intent to harm, or were we trying to just break the ice? So yeah, I think there's a lot to consider, and it's quite multifaceted in that sense. But yeah, I think Colleen's summed everything up quite well.
Awesome. But don't mute yourself just yet, because I would like to hear from you actually, just from a psychology perspective, maybe from a bullying perspective, if that would it all make sense. But why do people bully? Why does that happen?
It's a really good question, and unfortunately, it does not have a simple answer, which also makes it more complicated to address. But there are multiple factors that can feed into that. There are some certain personality traits that might lend themselves to bullying, but there are also organizational factors that can result in bullying. So maybe just starting on some of the personality traits. Some studies, like Pallison et al. 2017, found they compared bullies' personality traits to that of victims as well as a control group. And they found that bullies generally have lower levels of conscientiousness. So this is a trait linked with being responsible, careful, diligent, those types of things. And yeah, generally scored a little bit lower on those areas, as well as lower levels of agreeableness. So this is a trait that's linked with being kind, sympathetic, cooperative, warm, considerate. I just want to say though, just because someone is lower in conscientiousness and lower in agreeableness, it does not make them a bully automatically. It's just something that could potentially feed into it. And that's why we need to look at it on multiple levels. So yeah, I think on an organizational level, like Colleen said, some things can just be what we do around here. So some people can actually be rewarded for bullying behavior, and it motivates them to continue it. So this generally pops up in the kind of culture that's a win at all costs culture. I'm aware of instances where if an employee hasn't met targets, a manager might call them up, make them say a joke, do a dance, might take their chair away. And it all looks like a bit of a joke, but in some instances that could be workplace bullying. But when that's reported to HR, they're told that that is a company culture. So what happens from that point on is that people see, oh, if I want to progress in this company, I need to, call people out, potentially humiliate them. I need to be comfortable being a jokester. And that kind of culture then just continues, and they think I need to exhibit these behaviors to push ahead. And it doesn't need to be that direct. I think we could see a management style of being really authoritative and firm, and we start to kind of model what we're seeing. I think another important point in terms of what could cause bullying is when people are in really stressful, pressure jobs and they feel like they don't have enough support, they can actually end up bullying other people as a response to that. So I don't think we can say psychologically one thing causes bullying, but I think we need to look at it on a personal level, on an organizational level. What are the pressures this person is under? And then from that point, we can try and address it holistically.
The one word that keeps coming up for me is a lot of variables and complexity. That's the one word. I think it's totally complex.
That is the perfect sum up. Yeah. We can even see that with people battling with the definition.
Yeah, it's complex when we try to figure out, is it that, is it not that? It's complex when we try to figure out why is it happening? So maybe latching onto that complexity, I would say that the solution or addressing workplace bullying when we think it's taking place is also complex. So how would you suggest, and maybe I'll open it, Colleen, to you as well. Nadine, you're also welcome to pitch in here. But let's say we think that bullying might be taking place. What do we do? So what is the role of the manager, for example? What are the roles of the bystanders, people who might be observing the behavior? What do we do? What process do we follow? What steps do we take?
I love the word of we think bullying might be taking place, because unfortunately that is the case. It's really hard to draw that line. I think sometimes there might be a clear-cut instance, like if there is physical violence or something like that, but mostly, unfortunately, it's quite difficult to distinguish the types of bullying behaviors. I did say earlier, if you make a joke, is that bullying if you're cutting someone else down? I think another thing that makes it difficult is this idea of reasonable management action. So if an employee is not performing what a manager deems necessary, that employee might see as an abuse of power or incredibly harmful. So we need to kind of get everyone on the same page and, let the person know that, hey, this behavior is harmful and it therefore cannot continue. So what I would suggest, and I'm not saying it is the only way, but I think it might be how I might encourage things to move forward, is just building awareness on the harm that's being caused. Okay, whether it's the joke, whether it's the manager that's coming down too harshly, everyone needs to be aware of the harm that's being caused. So in some cases, a victim or perceived victim might feel like they're not comfortable being in a room with the person that is accused of bullying and a third party to clear the air. So if they're not comfortable, obviously that is a priority, and we'd then just have, for example, a manager or an HR rep draw to their attention that their behavior is harming someone else. I think it just takes out the ambiguity, and from that point, we can agree on an action plan to kind of stop the behavior and stop the harm being caused. And I think from that point, if the person continues the behavior, knowing that it's harming them, knowing that it's causing issues, from that point, it is easier to address. They've said that they would stop, they haven't stopped, and it becomes a little bit easier from the organization side. I think maybe one thing I just want to quickly throw in is one thing that often happens is bullying is reported and the person just never hears back. They don't know if anything's been done, nothing gets addressed. So I think we really just need to check in with the person that's feeling victimized after the report. Let them know that the conversations happened, make sure that they're not being targeted even further because they've spoken out, and just let them know that they are being heard and that support will be provided if the actions continue from there.
Colleen, I don't see that you are muted. Do you have something to throw in there?
I think what Sarah's touched on is hugely important. It speaks to the relational elements, not to mention the complexity and that it's multi-causal. But when she speaks about bringing awareness, I think that is a key step, but it's systemic. So in terms of harm, it's for people to understand it's not only people being harmed, which is important. I've got a study that I'll share with you, or you can look it up on the France Telecom suicide case. There was something like 19 employees that left notes, and the case is concluded with 3 of the directors going to jail. And that's beyond that, the company reputation and the cost to that organization. So it shows you how much harm can come to not only people, societies, families, and reputational and monetary damage to organizations. So if we link that back to the big why is it important? I'm sure you can pick up, I'm very passionate about this topic, that I think it's important for practitioners, for people in organizations, for leaders, for HR representatives, to really bring that awareness and education, equip themselves to be able to have these conversations. And the relational element that Sarah touched on is communicate. Radio silence is the worst thing around bringing up a topic like this, being vulnerable about it, and then never having to hear back from people that you perceive to trust, that you trust to take this case and do something about it. So for me, awareness, education, and then practice. So whatever tools you equip yourself with, to put those into practice. And I think it takes everybody in an organization to co-create the kind of culture that they all want to be part of. And that takes away the putting it onto the shoulders of HR or line managers. And it also takes away the potential risk, should any of those people be involved, that the whole organization is following some kind of a cultural manifesto, and that any interaction helps in co-creating and cultivating a healthier workplace culture that you can put to stop and prevent harm that's caused to individuals and organizations.
I like that.
Yeah.
And I think you are touching on, you briefly touched on it, but let's consider, something happened to me and I want to go and report it. It's reputations at stake, right? It's, if I mention this, what if it's not really true? Or what if someone sees my behavior as bullying, but it's not true? So maybe let's talk a bit about, how organizations handle reports of bullying in a way that is fair to all parties involved. So the potential victim is heard and something is actually being done, but the person being accused, they are also rightfully protected, if that makes sense. So throwing it out there, Sarah, what do we do? How do we handle those reports?
I think I'd like to just go back to what I said earlier about awareness. I think we need to make the person being accused aware that their behavior is harmful, because like you said, they may not know and they're worried about their reputation. I think people coming forward will be scared to report that kind of thing, but that also links back to Colleen's comment on culture. We need to try and create a culture in organizations where people say, hey, are you okay? What made you speak to your colleague like that? A culture where people don't feel like reporting bullying might hinder their career, but rather engaging in bullying behaviors, that could actually hinder their career. I think for me, what's also very important, just from a company perspective, is companies often adopt the zero tolerance policy when it comes to bullying. Colleen and I were actually saying this before everyone jumped on. But often if the person being accused is a high performer or someone very high up in the company, it just gets brushed under the carpet. And I think if we have a zero tolerance policy, it does not matter if the person's a high performer, it does not matter their title or their position. They're not following organizational policies and protocols and expected behavior, and they need to be held accountable for that. But yeah, I like what you said earlier. We can't assume that someone is, guilty of bullying. They really may not have known that they had done it. So it really is just about handling the situation with care.
Mm. I like that you are mentioning the zero bullying, because I feel like it's much more than just the zero bullying tolerance posters that we see in the office kitchen, Would you say, would you say there are certain things besides what we've already mentioned that we as support, perhaps to organizations, can do to really improve workplace environments? How can we assess those environments? What can we do to support?
Excellent question. I think what managers could do is just create a safe place for employees to speak about concerns. I mentioned earlier that people can exhibit bullying behaviors if they're in a really high pressure environment and don't have the support they need. And if we can get people to open up about those types of things rather than direct the frustration at someone else, it could go far in terms of limiting the behaviors. And I think it'll also give people that are feeling victimized the confidence and the space to stand up and say something. I think we have a question if someone would like to jump in, and then I will carry on.
Cool. Fazisu, I see you have your hand up. Do you want to throw your question at us? Or do you have something that you'd like to share? Oh, and then our hand. Was that not intentional? I assume not. Okay, Sarah, do you want to continue perhaps?
I will continue very happily. Thank you, Tone. I think just in terms of how we can improve environments and all of that, I think leadership training could be a really powerful tool. Research has shown that if people perceive leadership to have poor leadership within the company, there are increased incidents of workplace bullying. Also, things like quite an autocratic leadership style, as well as toxic leadership, which is a bit dehumanizing and creates that atmosphere of fear. That's when bullying often takes place. So if we can empower managers with good leadership styles, like a democratic leadership style that encourages people to share ideas, if we can empower leaders to create development opportunities for people and have work plans and support them on their journey, we can also just help reduce the chances of those bullying behaviors emerging. I think also just culturally encouraging teamwork, kind of creating a humane environment. And just also emphasizing that accountability, that it doesn't matter what position you're in, bullying is taken seriously and it's a consistent approach. I think that would be the comments on my end. I don't know if anyone else wants to add to that.
Well, I think, Sarah, what you say is so important. Starting at the leadership level is vital. That style tends to filter throughout the organization, and what we don't as humans often understand is that our emotions seep out whether we like it or not. So awareness is so important, and that being the first pillar of emotional intelligence. There are studies that show increasing emotional intelligence does alleviate some of these toxicities that exist in organizations. And as awareness is the first pillar of emotional intelligence, it's vital to not only understand how from yourself, how you're showing up for others, but also to be able to see clearly how you are showing up from other people's perspective. Mm-hmm. And I think it's so important for leaders to build on their own internal and external self-awareness, seeing for themselves and seeing how they show up for other people, but also to be able to meet people where they're at, and to be able to ask for feedback, and to create that safety. So we all have probably heard about psychological safe environments and how important it is to cultivate them, but how do we do that actually in our day-to-day interactions? And how do we know that what we're doing is effective? And oftentimes it comes down to meeting people where they're at and also asking for feedback, but then being able to hear the feedback and do something positive with it without being triggered by what's coming at you. So leadership training, equipping yourselves, and then also not shying away from these sometimes courageous conversations. We haven't got time to go into all the details of why people avoid this topic and everything around it, but I think it's important to be able to check in with yourselves around whether or not you can turn toward these difficult conversations, whether you're a leader, a colleague, a witness to bullying, or experiencing bullying yourself. I think it's important to be able to check in with yourself and raise the awareness, and then figure out what you might need in terms of equipping yourself and other people as a collective in your organizations.
Yeah, for sure. I like, you know, the self-awareness part. I always say to people, we can't go outward unless we go inward. So it all starts with, let me go inward first and see what's going on in that environment. And then the outward will change. Nadeem, I'm going to give you the mic, and I would love for us to get into just, you know, what legally are we supposed to do? How can we protect ourselves as organizations? How can, you know, people protect themselves? What are some of those processes and stuff? So maybe my first question to you is, speak to me about those legal protections, right? So what legal protections exist for employees who are indeed victims of workplace bullying?
Thanks. Yeah, listening to Colleen and Sarah, I mean, a lot of the things they mentioned overlap to some extent with ways in which an employer can create and enhance a workplace that's free from bullying, and a workplace that does not have any harassment in it, because there is a legal obligation on an employer to eliminate harassment from the workplace. So before I get to the meat of your question, I think it's important to set up some context. There is quite a bit of legislation that deals with harassment, and bullying usually is a subset of harassment within the legal framework. And I know we sometimes struggle to come to a definition for some of these things, but at least within the legal context, we thrive on definitions. So the legislation provides definitions for a lot of these things. The key legislation in the context of the workplace is the Code of Good Practice on the Prevention and Elimination of Harassment in the Workplace, which is a code that was published, the most recent version of it in 2022, if I'm not mistaken, and it's published under the Employment Equity Act. And the code describes harassment as a form of unfair discrimination. And bullying, again, as I said, is a subset of harassment. The code explains and defines a number of forms, or numerous forms of behavior, one of which is bullying, but in the way in which people ordinarily think, a lot of these things can be thought about as bullying. So bullying is defined as the abuse of coercive power by an individual or group of individuals in the workplace. But then the code goes on to explain that there can be verbal bullying, there can be psychological abuse, physical harassment, online harassment, intimidation, passive-aggressive behavior. And so these are various forms of harassment. And then it also says that these things can manifest either in the form of sexual harassment, where there's a sexual component towards it, or where language that is used may be sexist or homophobic or anti-LGBTQ. So that's a form of harassment as well, which we could also call bullying. But you also have forms of bullying that can manifest in the way of racial discrimination or discrimination on the basis of social origin. So that's the context we're looking at. But before I get to kind of what the protections are, I think it's also important to understand from a legal perspective, at least in terms of this code, what is the definition of harassment? Right. So what is harassment? What is the definition of harassment according to the code? And it defines it as having three elements. The first is it's unwanted conduct that impairs a person's dignity. So that's the first element. The second element is that it creates a hostile working environment for employees or for workers, and is calculated to have the effect of inducing submission by threats, either real or perceived threats. And the third thing is that it's related to one of the grounds of discrimination in the Employment Equity Act. And what's important to note here is that those grounds are, there's a number of grounds. You can look at the Employment Equity Act. It's in Section 6, I think, of the Employment Equity Act. And what they deal with is issues of gender, of race, of sexual orientation, disability, political opinion, conscience, social origin, HIV, and it also includes a ground which is called arbitrary ground, which needs to have some sort of relation to one of these listed grounds. So that is kind of the definition of harassment, and this is the basis upon which the legislation affords protections to the employees. So one of the things that an employee is entitled to, it's entitled to work in the workplace that's free of harassment, where the employer has taken steps to eliminate harassment. So what does the employer need to do in this regard? It needs to conduct a risk assessment, number one. So identify historical and current risks for harassment in the workplace, identify the manner in which the company will address these risks. Number two, it needs to review its policies. So if it doesn't have a policy, it is compelled to have a policy that deals with harassment. So one of the questions in the chat asks, should we do something in terms of values, or should we have a policy? And I think that the most appropriate answer would be both. So you have a policy. You need to have a policy in terms of the code, which sets out the approach of the employer, which says that harassment, which includes bullying, will not be tolerated in the workplace. There will be consequences for this. What are these consequences? There will be disciplinary action, for example, and it sets out a procedure to deal with issues of harassment that's reported to it or that comes to its attention. And it should also consult all relevant stakeholders. So the code applies. This is important to know. The code applies to everyone in the workplace. So it applies to the employer. It applies to all employees of whatever position they may be in, whether they be in low-level jobs, whether it be managers, whether it be senior employees, senior management. It applies to interns, to volunteers. It applies to clients. It applies to people who are providing services to the workplace. So it's quite expensive. And then the third thing that the employer needs to do is conduct training and awareness. So it needs to ensure that employees and all the relevant stakeholders are educated about their rights and obligations. And in this regard, unions, trade unions, if they are present in the workplace and they have organizational rights, also bear some onus here to ensure that there's some sort of education or training that takes place in relation to the policy. And so the point of this is to make people aware of the policy, to make people aware of the content of the policy, to make people aware that harassment is not to be tolerated in the workplace. It is a form of unfair discrimination. And make sure that the policy is available, right? Make sure that the policy is available, make sure that it's accessible and people understand its content. It must also make sure as part of the training that people are aware of the reporting mechanisms through which they can report harassment. And a person can report harassment if they're a victim of it. They can report harassment if they've witnessed it. They can they can assist also a fellow employee to report harassment insofar as that person may require that assistance. And I think it's also important to create an ongoing awareness about the duty to report harassment through these training and awareness initiatives to ensure that there, there is a mechanism, there is a process by which you can report it, number one. Number two, that the information that you submit will be investigated. So we're not just going to sit on the report. Three, that the details that are going to be reported will be dealt with confidentially insofar as that's possible. And I think that's important to communicate, because that creates a culture of trust and a culture of people feeling confident enough to report harassment if and when it happens. And then the fourth thing is to establish a certain amount of resources to deal with this. And that depends on the size of the business. It also depends on the budget of the business. But at its most fundamental level, it includes at least establishing some sort of procedure or committee or person, whether that rests in HR or whether that rests in your legal function, to investigate claims of harassment and ensure that there is sufficient capacity to investigate and respond to those claims. So overall, that's kind of what's expected from the employer. That's what an employee can reasonably expect from an employer. That they have a policy in place, that they conduct awareness training, that people are aware that harassment is not will not be tolerated, that there's a process by which reports about harassment can be lodged, and through which they can be investigated, and through which appropriate action can be taken, whether that be disciplinary action, whether that be counseling, and so on. The code also, I think maybe it's important, maybe I can say it here, also sets out two specific procedures which an employee needs to follow whenever it receives a report of harassment. Right, so someone reports sexual harassment or bullying or some sort of whether it be racism, verbal abuse, physical violence, any of these type of things, reports it to the employer. What the employer needs to do, it first needs to investigate the complaint to determine whether there's a valid basis for the complaint. If there is one, then it can follow one of two processes. It can follow what the code calls a formal or an informal process. Now, the employee or the person who's reporting the harassment, or who's a victim of the harassment, can indicate their preference. They can say we prefer a formal, or we prefer an informal process. However, the discretion lies with the employer to determine the most appropriate one. An informal process basically results in an example would be a type of discussion that's had. And this is usually where there isn't any trust relationship that's broken down between the employer or the parties in relation to the perpetrator of the harassment. And it's usually used in instances where the harassment is of a mild form, and where a discussion can take place between the parties to be that will go along the lines of, look, this type of conduct you may not have been aware is completely not okay. You don't conduct yourself this way, and the person apologizes, and maybe if there's some sort of awareness training the person needs to go for, counseling to remedy the behavior, and the matter can be resolved in that way. A more formal process is where you'd have a process where, especially in instances of quite severe harassment, and you may need to potentially suspend the employee in order to ensure a safe workplace. And this is where you're potentially looking at reaching a point of terminating a person's employment because the trust relationship is broken down. And that would require a more formal process where the version of the victim, the evidence that's collected during the investigation process, is collated and curated and presented before the perpetrator to answer a case or to answer a version of events, and with a view to then coming to an appropriate sanction for the time, if the perpetrator is actually found guilty of the conduct. So that's something else that's built into the code in terms of the process that needs to be utilized by the employer. So this is a legal obligation upon employers, and it's something which employees are entitled to in relation to how an employer needs to conduct itself in relation to harassment in the workplace.
Fascinating. I feel like my head is spinning. Sarah, Colleen, I think you gave such great insights, Nadeem, and it's so like I love the structure, and yeah, it's good. My head is spinning. But I think you touched on, when we start to investigate, is there a valid basis? Maybe talk us through what are some of those elements that are necessary to prove that, yes, this was actually indeed a form of harassment. I know you briefly touched on the various forms as well, but let's say someone comes and they report it, and we now need to go and investigate this complaint, will I call it. What are we looking for? Should that employee bring us a trail of emails where we can actually see the verbal abuse happening or harassment happening? What are those elements that we need to actually prove that it is indeed true?
So I think so that's a good question, but I think it's important to think about it this way. A person who is a victim of harassment shouldn't concern themselves too much on what type of evidence they have before reporting it. I think it's important that they report it, right? Irrespective of what evidence may exist. Now, each case will be determined on the basis of the facts in that case. So that's the first point. The second point is, irrespective of the nature of harassment, whether it's serious, whether it's not so serious, depending on who is considering it, even the victim, whether it was a single incident of harassment or whether it was a repeated incidents of harassment, in all of those circumstances, they are reportable. Thirdly, if there is, so for example, if the harassment took place in an open plan office where, say, someone touched another person inappropriately and there were witnesses, that's a form of evidence. For example, that those people who witnessed, who saw what transpired. If there are text messages over WhatsApp, if there was email communication, if the person conducted themselves inappropriately in a meeting, again, there's other people who may be there to witness what had transpired. So those are all different forms of evidence that can be provided, and which the employer, if it hasn't been furnished to the employer would ordinarily ask for during its investigation, to say, when did it take place, at what time did it take place, how often did this incident take place, can you narrate the details, were there any witnesses, if you say the person said certain things to you, was this in public, was this on a WhatsApp message, was this in an email, that type of thing. But also in incidents where maybe none of that occurred, and a person says, look, I was alone with the person, I don't have anything, there's no camera footage, there's no, it can still be reported, because what the person is putting forward is a version of events. And what the purpose of that is to test the version of events against probably a version that the perpetrator will put forward. So either the perpetrator will say, yes, that actually did take place, I'm sorry, or may not be apologetic, I'm not sure. Or the perpetrator will say, no, that didn't take place, but here's what happened. So let me give you an example, and just remember the code also indicates that workplace harassment is not limited to the formal workplace. So if you're traveling together for a work meeting to a third location, and something transpires during that process or that period of time, that still is covered by the code. If you went to a restaurant for an end of year function and something transpires there, that's also covered by the code. If you are traveling together in transport that's been organized by the employer, so the workplace in effect gets extended to all of these instances. But say a person is gone to a meeting and they've traveled to a different city for a meeting, and at the accommodation that they're staying over, that they're being put up at, one one of the persons conducts themselves inappropriately in a way that constitutes sexual harassment, they will put forward their various versions of what occurred, for example. And then those versions on a balance of probabilities will be taken into account and will be tested by the employer to determine the veracity of the details. And remember, we look at, in employment law, we look at evidence is weighed on a balance of probabilities, not in criminal law beyond a reasonable doubt. So it's a much lower threshold to prove. So that's kind of how evidence will be collected, and that's how evidence will be weighed or determined in relation to any reports that are lodged with the employer.
Mm.
The other thing, that's important to note, I think,
Yeah.
is maybe connected to this, is that harassment can take place. What the code makes clear, and I know this may seem as common knowledge to a lot of people, but given, sometimes we also have our own biases, is that harassment can take place in any form, irrespective of the position of the parties. So the code does talk about hierarchy may play a role, where it's easier for a person to think they can get away with harassment if they're in a position of power, authority over another person. But harassment can also take place the other way around, right? There's different types of power dynamics at work. Position is just one of those power dynamics. And so harassment can take place between where a junior, someone who's considered to be a more junior person in an organization, is actually the perpetrator of it. Harassment, sexual harassment, for example, can take place where a male could be a victim of sexual harassment at the hands of a woman, or there could be same-gender sexual harassment. And it's not always opposite sex harassment, where generally the male is the perpetrator. That definitely is one of the more common forms of harassment in the workplace, but it's not restricted to that. So that's also important to keep in mind.
Mm. Yeah. I think what you said earlier on gave me so much hope, just, to tell people that it doesn't matter what evidence you have. It doesn't matter, the intensity that you feel, just report it. The important thing is that you speak up and just report what you are experiencing. Colleen, I see you unmuted. Do you want to add something?
I'm just piggybacking off of what you just said. It's giving people the hope that something can be done. It's still a very traumatic process for people to go through, I would imagine, regardless of how mild or severe the harassment or bullying is. And I think it's vital to get the necessary support, whether it's a coaching relationship, counseling relationship, how to encourage people to report it, how to equip them to necessarily to speak up, but also to help them understand that they wouldn't be alone in this, because it's such a traumatic, it could potentially be traumatic for people. My question to Nadine would be, how long does a typical case last? And how can we understand that if people are suffering under harassment or bullying circumstances, if they have got the support, how long would a typical case last? And do you have positive stories of cases for us?
Yeah, so I mean, look, how long it would last, again, depends on each case. I mean, what the code does expect employees is to investigate and complete the process as expeditiously as possible. So there shouldn't be a delay that's occasioned by the employer that's not a reasonable, for which they don't have a reasonable explanation. The code also places an obligation on the victim of harassment or the person who's reporting the harassment to report it as soon as possible. Sometimes in case law, the word immediately would be used, but we've come to know now through judicial precedent that what that means is that as soon as possible means as soon as possible as is most reasonably required in the specific context. There may be reasons why a victim may choose to delay reporting. They may choose to delay reporting because they filled with shame, or they don't feel comfortable doing it, or they scared of negative repercussions, all of which are quite reasonable for a person to feel, even if they may not be actual, they may not actually realize, but they may be at least that victim's perception. So in those instances, those types of delays can be condoned. An employer cannot say, "Oh, you've reported it to me 5 months later from when the event occurred. I'm not going to look into this." That's not the basis on which an employer can ignore it. However, what we must bear in mind is the longer a person takes to report something, the bigger the gap is, the harder it is to sometimes collect evidence, and people resign, people leave the workplace, that type of thing. So if you're reporting something 2 or 3 years or 4 years down the line, and you say, "I'm reporting an incident that took place 4 years ago," the employer still needs to receive the complaint. The employer is still obligated to investigate the complaint, even though it's reported so long down the line. What just happens is then the links become much more tenuous. So, to start collating, you say there were witnesses 4 years ago. Now, to round up the witnesses who were there 4 years ago, some of them may not be in the workplace anymore. You may not be able to contact them. Even if you are able to contact them, they may be, "I don't remember, I don't recall the situation," that type of thing. So those type of things can happen. In terms of, in terms of how you report it, in terms of the length of delay, in terms of how long it takes, it places an obligation to expeditiously resolve it. It doesn't give you a specific timeline. So it doesn't say you must do this within 5 days or 1 week or 1 month, but there shouldn't be any delay. In terms of examples, there's many cases which have gone to the labor court, for example, where there have been incidents of harassment taking place, and where there have been claims for damages. There have been claims where the court have found the employer didn't do all that it could do to eliminate harassment in the workplace or to respond to a claim of harassment, and was held liable. The employer was held vicariously liable in that instance. There are claims where, and in that instance, a fine was issued on the employer. There are instances where employees have managed to secure damages against the perpetrator and the employer, in instances where the courts have found that the employer did not sufficiently act to protect the employee. Now, one of the ways in which employers can ensure that there's compliance with the Act is, again, those things that I've mentioned. Conduct a risk assessment, have a policy, conduct training, deal adequately with any report of harassment that comes to your attention, investigate it immediately, and take the appropriate action. Employers are also, in terms of the code, there is, you mentioned support, there is an area where employers, so it's not, so an employer should render support insofar as it's able to do so. So, for example, if you can provide extra leave or additional leave to an employee in circumstances of where they have been a victim of harassment and they need that leave, for example. An employer, and say the employee doesn't have leave at its disposal, an employer should try and provide an employee with that leave, insofar as the employer can provide the employee with counseling or certain or maybe therapy or services that could emotionally support the person. They should do so. Insofar as the employee needs assistance to submit a complaint, they may be so shocked or traumatized by the event that had transpired, and they come to you and say something has happened, but they don't really know how to completely tell their story or to lodge a complaint. If the HR should actually assist the employee in putting together that complaint for the employer. So those type of things are part of the code as well. I don't know if that answers your question to some extent.
It's just bringing up a whole lot of more curious questions, but thank you for answering what you can now. It's just a case of if organizations need to pay fines or, is to what end is the question coming up for me. To what end would an employee want to report this in terms of justice? Because you can't always buy back your dignity, for example, but to get some perpetrator to just simply stop. In terms of the process, it would be interesting to find out if an employee has been subject to harassment or bullying, and they've asked the person to stop, and they don't stop, and then they report the case, and it goes through the legal system. How do you then go back and check up on, or for the person to continue working in this kind of environment? I think are all the questions that are coming up. But it's fascinating.
There's a lot of things. There's different things an employer can do. There's different, depending on the nature, because remember, the code is quite expensive on what bullying is and what it entails. And so, for example, if someone, you say there was an act of racism in the workplace where someone used a term that was racially offensive, right? So then an employer, that report gets lodged. There are witnesses. So say there's no dispute on what that entailed. Then, I mean, an employee can indicate to say also, the process allows for that, to say, look, an apology would be adequate here, would be sufficient, but it needs to be maybe a public apology to ensure that everyone. So those type of discussions take place during the process. If it's an instance where a person really, the perpetrator risks the workplace not being a safe place, then ultimately what you're going to arrive at is a sanction of dismissal or termination of employment, where the perpetrator would need to vacate or exit that workplace, because having the person there, and this depends on, if it's, for example, if there was a physical assault, that's a clear example of a very serious type of misdemeanor, or sexual assault, or things like that. An employer can also elect, maybe if there was less serious forms of harassment, where it wouldn't really go to the point of terminating the employment of the perpetrator, but there could be definitely cause or reason for why the employee shouldn't have to interact with that person in the workplace. And then the employer will need to try and accommodate that to the extent where the employee will not need to communicate or not find themselves in the same environment as the perpetrator. And that comes up with a whole lot of other logistical issues, and to what extent that can be accommodated by the employer. So again, it's very difficult, as lawyers will always tell you. We can't, we try not to answer questions broadly. Some of them we can tell you what the legislation says, we can tell you what compliance says. But each case comes up with a number of factors which will determine the type of response and the type of conclusion that you end up with. And that would ultimately be dependent on the very specific factors of each specific case.
That's all I can say. I think this has been super informative, and maybe as a closeout question, Nadeem, it also came up in a personal message to me. Just as a last one, we did speak about this. You mentioned, the fines and damages, but what other consequences are there for organizations that fail to actually address workplace harassment or bullying? What have you witnessed and seen over the years?
So in terms of legal consequences, the code makes it very clear that if the employer has not complied with the code, has not reasonably done what it could have done in order to eliminate harassment from the workplace, or to respond to instances of harassment, then it will be held vicariously liable. And what that basically means, it will be held liable as if it was the perpetrator in the space, in the position of the perpetrator. And so that should be a sufficient cause of concern for employers. It shouldn't be the only reason why they want to be compliant. I think employees should try and imbue their ethos and their workplace with value systems outside of, we're only doing it because otherwise we'll be punished for it.
Yeah.
That's not the main motivation, but it should be at least some motivation for you to get your ducks in a row, so to speak, to ensure that you are compliant. So a lot of the time, it's not that employers also sometimes, or companies, organizations, don't care about this issue. It's just that it's so much of work. Let's delay the policy. We need to review it, and then it's always not given the urgency that it's required. And so maybe the one piece of advice that I will give companies that are not compliant or not sure if they're compliant, to really treat this with the urgency that it deserves. Wherever you have people, wherever you have employees, wherever you have social engagements and interactions, there is always room or scope for harassment taking place. And if you don't have clearly demarcated boundaries, if you don't have awareness, if you don't have training, if you don't have policies, if employees themselves don't know what to do in such circumstances, if they've witnessed or been a victim of harassment, then that is a problem for the employer. And so they should urgently try and deal with these type of gaps in the organization.
Great. That is it. I am going to maybe open it up. I don't see any questions coming up in the chat right now, but if there's anyone who maybe wants to unmute themselves and ask their question, you're more than welcome to do so. I'll give us a minute or so to see if anyone wants to take us up on that offer.
I think Tone Bukilwe was looking for links to the studies. I'm assuming everyone is registered. You've got all their contact details should we want to get in touch with anyone who's asking links.
Indeed.
Okay.
Sure. Yeah, we'll make sure that we have a follow-up email going out to everyone. I've also popped my email address in the chat. So if you do want to communicate with us or reach out, then you're welcome to do so. Nadeem, thank you very much. It was super informative. It was such a privilege to have you on the call this afternoon. Sarah, to you as well. Thank you. But wait, there's more. We have a question. How do we help a team who has been exposed to workplace bullying? Great question. I'm going to leave it up to you. Sarah, Colleen, what do we do? How do we help a team?
Well, I'm going to jump in, Sarah, and please feel free to jump in as well. We need to, if a whole team has been exposed to bullying, I think it's important to be able to have a focus group with the team and systems entry. Team systems entry is so important. So to be able to have an objective viewpoint is always key. To have someone enter the team system and provide the foundational support is crucial. If there are certain members of the team, I think that's a different approach. But if a team has been exposed to workplace bullying, it's important to, like I say, create the foundation of safety, build rapport with the team, and then to be able to help them share what are some of the examples that they are facing and how to best support them and get them to support each other in working through the process. I think systems support systems, and with Nadeem's insight and wisdom, I think it's vital that practitioners, leaders collaborate with people in the legal system to be able to know what are we dealing with in terms of the legislation, in terms of policy, in terms of process, and then getting down to what are the details that we need to work with and support people in working through what it is they need to do, whether it's as individuals or whether it's as a team. I hope that answers your question, Lemay.
I see she elaborated a little bit.
Yeah, I worked with a team that in a team session were told about a harassment incident of a team member with another manager. How do you address both the individual and the team to go forward? So I would definitely say you need to chat to the individual separately, and then also with permission and confidentiality at the fore, be able to talk together in a group about what are some of the issues that have emerged. Because if some of the team members have witnessed that, they could also have secondary or residual trauma as a result of that, and then they would be subject to whatever is going on. Does that answer your question? Oh, I got a big heart from them there. Thank you.
Sarah, do you want to hop in here?
Yeah, I think Colleen covered that well, but maybe just an additional point is we can always offer coaching sessions, counseling sessions, just a place for employees to open up, speak freely. I think coaching can even benefit someone who has acted as a bully, just in terms of, better ways to handle things going forward, a little bit of EQ training in terms of, looking inward first, like you started with, Twine. Yeah, so those ad hoc kind of interventions can also be very helpful. I think that would be my only little add there.
Oh, I've got to add to what Sarah's just said. If a person is being seen to be a bully or shows any of the what's called the dark side of personality, narcissism, Machiavellianism, or psychopathology, how to see the person at their core essence, because Sarah, what you've just said is so crucial. People are labeled as bullies, but they're humans too. So how do you get to the core essence of who they are and also be able to support them on their own journey of change? So that was quite an insightful add there, Sarah. Thank you.
Twine, could I maybe just add one thing, just because it was a real case, and I think to Nadim's point as well, it was really important for that team to also get feedback on the process that was going to be followed, because they obviously were quite traumatized by hearing this piece of information, but also really concerned for their team member and what process would be followed. And so that was just quite an important point, having gone through it, constantly asking, some of the team members constantly would ask, what happened? What's happening now? How are we going to follow up? How do we support the team member? Should we remain quiet? Should we? So I think that was also just a lesson learned for me, is having a firm feedback loop around process, around how do you support the team member, what you are able to share, what you are not able to share, and giving that feedback, because they obviously go back into that environment, not just the victim, but also the team members who are now privy to that information, who potentially work with that manager and are not able to voice that they know until the investigation has been concluded. So it was quite important, just from a process point of view, to make that feedback loop. So yeah, it was just quite an interesting case study that I thought maybe throw it in there and share.
Super valuable. Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Lemay. Yeah, that debrief and just realizing, like you said, that they now know. And we need to help them sit with that information and know, okay, but how do we also support them to go back into that environment? So very, very helpful. Thanks for sharing that with us. That is it. It was lovely. I've seen the feedback in the chat. Everyone loved it. Great session, super relevant. So I think, yeah, it was good. A lot of people hopefully walked away with quite a few nuggets. So to the three of you, I thank you. And I hope you have a fabulous Friday. And to everyone, your reminder again that tomorrow is Friday. So I hope you have a great weekend. And we hope to see you soon again.